to speak with you and to study God's word together as sisters. Today, what I'll do, at least the order of how I prepare the talk, is really to dive into the relationship. Okay. Yes, it's 1 second. Sorry. Yes. Yes, it's really to dive into the relationship, the character traits of Ahasuerus. And I did also Esther and Vashti. And then we'll delve a little bit into, I know it could be a long topic, so I try to be curt with it. We'll dive into how their character traits really worked into the dynamics of their relationship based on the story of Esther, right? So our readings were taken from Esther 1, typically 10 to 22, and Esther 2, 1 to 9. So those readings, really what I tried to do is capture Ahasuerus's, the introduction to him. So it would kind of give us an insight into how he was, outside of knowing he was a king of Persia. Introduction to Vashti as well. It's though short, though brief. The record is brief. It was very impactful. And then, of course, Esther's introduction into the whole scheme of things. So basically, we're talking about Ahasuerus, the king of Persia. Just to summarize, he orders his queen Vashti to appear before the guests because he threw a feast and she refuses. And so this act was taken as an act of defiance against her husband, and it led to her being dethroned as queen. And furthermore, they went on to make decrees that men should be masters of their own houses and stuff. Instead, in the case that other women decide to refute their husband's commandments. And then this introduces Esther, who, of course, now the king decides where the stain of Vashti's rebellion wore off quite a bit, and he decides, okay, I'm ready for our next queen. And so Esther comes into the story here. So she was a Jewish woman living in Persia, and she becomes queen of King Ahasuerus. So this is in a nutshell. And her cousin Mordecai discovers a plot by Haman, the king's advisor, at some point to exterminate the Jews. And Esther and Mordecai successfully intervene, and the Jews are saved. So in a nutshell, this is where Ahasuerus, Vashti, and Esther, they have their relationship. Though Vashti and Esther didn't have one directly, Ahasuerus was the common factor there. So let's talk about King Ahasuerus. Who was he? So he was a Hebrew named Ahasuerus. Some scholars believed that it's translated into Xerxes, the Greek name Xerxes. So they think that Ahasuerus is Xerxes I, the king. So that's just a side note. But Ahasuerus was a very powerful Persian king. And how do we know he's powerful? He ruled over 127 provinces. We got that from Esther chapter 1, from India to Ethiopia. So he was really powerful. He was married. Fact number 2, he was married to 2 very beautiful, strong-willed and determined women. So we were told that Vashti was beautiful, and of course, Esther herself was so in her own right. So we're going to look at, those are just facts on Ahasuerus, but we want to dive into who Ahasuerus really was. What was his character? So from my little studies, what I got was try to pull out a few character traits that I observed within the verses, right? So he was a powerful king, we know that. So Esther 1 verses 1 to 3, it says his palace was in Shushan, which was a major city in Persia. And in his first feast, many Medes and Persians, nobles, princes, rulers of the provinces, anybody who was somebody attended his feast, right? So he had the attention of all these influential people across Media and Persians, right? He seemed to me very extravagant. And I'm taking that from verse 4 and 5. He held a feast for the nobles and the influential people, verse 4 in chapter 1, for 180 days. It said 104 days. And at the end of that 180 days, he went on to hold a 7-day feast in Shushan for the smaller community. For the people who weren't mixing with the nobles and the influentials. Okay, let me hold the next one for the persons in Shushan. So to me, he seemed very extravagant, right? He seemed a bit showy and boastful. This is Ahasuerus, right? Verse 4. What he did in the feast for the nobles and the influentials was that he showed off the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty. So I got that from him. He's a bit showy and he's a bit boastful. And of course, from the fact that he tried to show off Vashti in his drunken stupor, I understand that naturally that's probably how he is. Outside of that, he seemed very excessive. And verse 6 and 7 of chapter 1, that's where I got that inclination from. What I observe is that the book of Esther was very detailed in describing the intricacies of his feast, meaning they spoke about the first feast that lasted 180 days for the nobles and the influentials. That was more about showing off his riches and stuff like that in the kingdom. And the other one in Shushan, he went all out for that. So in that second feast, the book described the hangings that were fastened with linen and silver rings, the silver and gold beds. This is all for the 7-day feast, right? There was a colored marble pavement. So they described each color and how the pavement was. And there was unlimited royal wine. And the book even went on to say, each person had their own golden vessel to drink from, and none was like the other. That to me seemed like, yes, Ahasuerus was this excessive person. So outside of holding feasts back to back, and one was so long, he went into, for each feast, he didn't hold back at all. So I got from that he seemed to be an excessive person. To me, he also seemed to have no personal boundaries. And this is where I got it from. Verse 8 and verse 10 from same chapter 1. He appointed all the officers of his house to, in the exact words, do according to every man's pleasure. So he didn't say, okay, we go up to here, or every man shall have this, or whatever. Do what you want. To me, so that was what the feast was. To me, a drunken stupor. And his heart was merry with wine by the 7th day. Verse 10 gives us that, right? So he was drunk. And that is the day that he called Vashti in. So to me, that was his natural inclination. A trait that I also picked up of Ahasuerus is that he thrived on image and status, and he had somewhat of a big ego. And verse 1 to 5, reading it over with that in mind, I observed that he was keen to show off, for everyone to know and partake in his feast, and from the richest of the nobles to the smallest of the persons in his kingdom should know, okay, who Ahasuerus is. And that's because of his wealth and his commandment over how many provinces and stuff. So he was powerful and he was rich, and everybody should know that. And that's what I got from Ahasuerus so far. What I also got is that his servants did all the heavy lifting. And throughout the chapters, let's say just chapter 1, verse 10, verse 13 to 16, verse 19 to 21, chapter 3, verse 1 to 2. I didn't go into all the others. So the first one is he commanded the servants to bring Vashti. So the servants brought Vashti. He inquired of his wise men what to do with Vashti. And in brackets, in that verse, they said, for so was the king's manner. So he's accustomed consulting and asking, right? Memucan suggested that a royal commandment be made after Vashti did her. So Memucan was one of the wise men that he consulted. And he went on to suggest, listen, we don't want the women across the provinces to upstand their husbands now, to think that it's okay to do that because Vashti got through with it. So she had to be made an example. He didn't even think twice. He was like, okay, the saying pleased the king. Haman came in and said, hey, we need to annihilate the Jews. Okay. There was another instance where he would have asked for, he didn't ask. Yes, he would have asked for guidance on something that generally when we read through the Chronicles and the Book of the Kings, a king will have some sort of a strong personality to say, okay, this is how this shall be. Ahasuerus was not that kind of king. He didn't appear that to me. He always consulted, or he always went on the advice of his servants. So to me, that in a nutshell was how Ahasuerus was. Outside of his wealth and So his physical wealth, and then of course of his power in terms of being in charge of. I think his personality was pretty small. So now I'm going on to Vashti. And so that's a point on Ahasuerus to note, so that when we go into their relationship, when they combine, we could look at the triumphs and trials, right? In the book of Esther, Vashti was a queen of Persia, the first wife of King Ahasuerus, right? Though her appearance was brief, just a couple of verses, the impact of her actions can't be understated. So I'm thinking that she charted the course for Queen Esther's reign. Without her refusing to come forward, that decree would have never been offered, and she wouldn't have been made the example. So she really just watched from the little interaction that she had with us here. When we read, we realize that yes, her actions were very impactful. So we're looking at some of Vashti's character from Esther chapter 1, because that's where they really where she took action, where we could probably hone in on what her personality may have been like. We know for sure she was beautiful. Verse 11, the king wanted to show off her beauty to all at the feast. And this is where I also got that he was quite a showy person. And at this point, he was also very drunk. So naturally, this is how he is. She seemed to be extroverted. And I mean, this could be queried, but I'm thinking she also held a feast for the women. And that's when he did the 180-day feast. So while he was doing that, she held a feast to the women. I'm thinking if yes, she was the queen, but she did not have to hold that feast for the women, and she didn't have to carry it on so long. But to me, having done that, while the verse that verse 9, sorry, that says she also held a feast, it means that it seemed to be in collaboration with when her husband held the feast on the other side. She may be considered a good hostess, of course, with sufficient resources, and I'm thinking the feast lasted for 7 days, so she was also, that's verse 10 in Esther chapter 1. She also carried out the 7-day feast. So while Ahasuerus was doing the men on this side, in Shushan, she did the females. She was obviously self-willed, and that came from verse 12 when she just defied her husband. He said, whether or not she had good reason, she just decided to defy her husband at all costs. So it would have been very impactful because the feast was there, and so everybody who is anybody was around. And in Shushan for the 7-day feast, everybody in Shushan was there as well. So that's something to consider before you defy the king. The king in its entirety, and then of course her husband, right? Being the same person. So she was definitely self-willed to do what she pleases in spite of. And I got also from verse 18, chapter 1, that she was influential to women in the provinces. And the reason why I came up with that was because the king and his chamberlain decided to issue the decree and make an example so that other women may not be influenced to defy their husbands as Vashti did. Right? So I got from that yes, it's not that she was a shunned queen or she was quiet and whatever, but she was probably looked upon and she was revered among the women in the provinces and stuff, being the wife of this not just wife, the beautiful wife of this very powerful king, Ahasuerus. Right? So in a nutshell, that's where I covered Vashti. Right? And I'm going on to Hadassah/Esther. So she was first introduced in the record in chapter 2 of her self-titled book, of course, the book of Esther, where her cousin Mordecai brought her up as an eligible maiden before King Ahasuerus. She was an orphan, we were told, so without mother or father. So Mordecai, it was actually her guardian. He assumed guardianship of her. They were Jews, and they were taken into captivity, right? When the Jews were taken into captivity, they were carried away from Jerusalem. Right? So this is a significant fact to note because it forms the understanding of Esther's purpose later on in the book. The fact that she kept to herself, being Jewish, until it mattered, as advised by her cousin Mordecai. She stood out among the maidens when they were called up. So the eligible maidens were called up and they went into the keeper, who's Hegai, the keeper of the women. And as soon as she went into there, she stood out. So he even gave her and the 7 maidens appointed to her special privileges. And furthermore, after their days of purification, which I think it was a year, so they had to do 6 months in myrrh and 6 months in something else. I can't remember offhand, but anyway, after that, they would have gone into the other chamberlain who would have then assessed their eligibility to go to the king. And she stood out. She stood out in every aspect of the purification process, the selection process and the purification process, to the point where as soon as the king saw her, that was the end of the process. He was bought hook, line, and sinker. That was as soon as the king saw her, he loved her above all the other women that were brought into him. That's how it was put. Not just loved her above all the other women. And she eventually became King Ahasuerus' queen and eventually saved the Jewish people from the mass massacre that Haman was planning. Right? So, in a nutshell, because of our limited time, we didn't go too much deeper into it. We just kind of play around in our minds of the personality of Ahasuerus, the personality of Vashti, the personality of Esther, and how those personalities intertwine into relationships. And I don't want to say tumultuous, or they're very dynamic events and occurrences. So we're looking at Esther's characteristics. What we did was just look at the facts of her, but what we can see from Esther is that we went into the character of Vashti and Ahasuerus. Her character, she was, of course, beautiful inside and out. Apart from being physically beautiful, she was a beautiful character inside. She was courageous, because of course she was fearful about really revealing herself and all of that and going to the king. However, she overcame that eventually. She was humble. So on top of being queen, she never forgot who she was, where she came from, and what her purpose is. She was obedient to all her uncle, a king, which is something that we could say Vashti may not have been. She was faithful and dependent on God. She was prayerful, right? Which is something that probably took her to where she is. She was she always knew that she depended on God for everything. In spite of her getting to the throne and all that, it was all part of God's purpose, and she acknowledged that. Of course, she loved her people. She loved you. She was patriotic, and she never forgot where she came from. She was very patient, very wise and very patient. And I guess that would come from prayer, and that would come from her trusting in God for making her decisions. And that would be, of course, influenced by her cousin, Mordecai, all right, being a devout Jew. Now, the time that it took between when she became queen, that's chapter 2, to chapter 10, if you look at how things flowed, Esther was very, not just methodical, but she was extremely patient in her decisions and her actions, something that we need to not look at chapter by chapter, but if we read through it, looking at Esther with her personality in mind, we will realize how clinical she was in her actions, in her speech, and of course, how prayerful she was. And on top of all of that, being humble, she was also a leader. So you don't have to be loud and probably outgoing or lavish to be a leader. Based on how she interacted with persons, it was easy to follow her. It was easy to want to emulate her. It was easy to listen to her instructions. So in a nutshell, that was Esther's personality traits. So we want to know what these 3 personalities brought to the table. I mentioned before that Ahasuerus, he may not have been, but this is just my interpretation of when I read through how Ahasuerus came across to me. He seemed not to have a strong personality outside of his physical power and wealth. but he thrived in his wealth as a cover for his otherwise weak personality. I got that from it. That could be discussed. What I also observed is that the dynamics of his relationships with his wives were really driven by his servants. If they said, you know, A, he said, yes, A. You know, B, yes, B. You should do this. Yes, I will do this. So he didn't sit and consider and think for himself and said, listen, I need to do this. This is where the kingdom always sought the advice of his servants. So he always had to have the professionals around him. Vashti was self-willed, and in this case, the self-willed was a point of obstinance, where whether or not she may have thought that she had a good reason, what she did was disrespect her husband, disrespect the king, right? She defied his commandment. And I mean, being in it for so long, well, 3 years, when he threw the feast, the first feast, the Esther chapter 1 said that he was 3 years in as king. So that was enough time for Vashti to know the ins and outs of it. So she knew, to me, she would have known what the consequences may have been defying the king, but she did it anyway. If you look at modern day now, some may think she's a heroine for women's liberation. It's just a thought that came to me, depending on what your standards are. They may seem, okay, he was drunk and he was this and he was that, so I'm not going into to him. And they may see it like that. But otherwise, if you look at it as the order of things, the order of the household, she defied her husband at the end of the day. Right? So we don't know how they started. We just knew that she was his king, right? When the book started, Vashti was Ahasuerus' king. So we don't know like how we have the Chronicles of Esther, where she would have gone in and stuff. We don't have those details out of Vashti, so we don't know the dynamics of how their relationship started. However, what we can see is during the account that we have of Ahasuerus and Vashti, it seemed to be okay because he would have called her up. Maybe it was in his drunken stupor, and maybe he was accustomed being drunk and Vashti probably had enough. You don't know. But when she said, I am not coming in, there was no indication of them having a real peaceful and loving and nurturing relationship. So, I mean, it's a thought. All right. So what was Esther's influence in the relationship now? And Ahasuerus' personality. What I went through there before in terms of their personalities, in terms of their the events that occurred was just up to Esther chapter 2. Really. We just in a nutshell went through the story, but all those personalities came from up to Esther chapter 2. In chapter 3, Haman was introduced. Now, by that time, Esther was king, Esther was queen, right? So Haman is now introduced. In true Ahasuerus style, Haman was like his second in command. If you think about it, Haman now became the go-to to the point where Ahasuerus' servants and princes worshipped Haman as if he was king. So to me, Ahasuerus, you could probably think he's lazy as well. Ahasuerus went to the fact that, okay, I have a second king. Do everything that you would do to me, to Haman. Right? So he was recognized as a powerful advisor and noticed, of course, he also has an ego issue. So when Mordecai, being a Jew, of course, a devout Jew, not just a Jew, did not bow to him, and he observed that, of course, he issued a decree, right? And he went to King Ahasuerus, and to me, I don't think he had to persuade him. All he had to do is tell him, listen, this is this. These Jews would think that you're not worthy of this. This one didn't bow to me. Let's kill them all, right? So he issued a decree to exterminate the Jews, and of course by a certain time, by a certain date, and of course, in true Ahasuerus style, it was okay. The yes man, right? Chapter 4, Mordecai, he was facing the decree. he spoke to Esther about this to intervene to the king. Now, of course, Ahasuerus had his reputation, right? And so she was very fearful. And that's why we have to acknowledge the courage, what it took to actually go to the king, to approach the king and release two facts. The fact that you were even Jewish and the fact that this is what you want to get done, right? So it wasn't easy. It's easy to read, but it was definitely, we have to really acknowledge how hard that was. But she knew that she had to do it, right? So what was the first thing that they did? Given her fear and given her having no choice, consulting with Mordecai, pray and fast. And she, as even being queen, she prayed and fasted with the Jews, with her people. She never lost sight of her heritage, which speaks to her humility, which I think we mentioned earlier. She now invites the king and Haman to a banquet. This is how wisdom comes in. And she didn't directly come out and said, Haman said, blah, blah, blah. But she subtly introduced them to the story, the threat of what Haman is intending to do. And the way how she approached them, of course, they bought into it. They started to listen. She also arranges a second banquet. Now, Haman himself is the head behind all this, and Haman did not even realize, if I look at it, that she was directly talking to him or about him. But whatever she told them made the king uneasy. And at this point, this is in chapter 6 now. Before, in all the chapters, we had everybody doing everything at the king's command. The king not even thinking for himself. He wants this, he asks somebody. He wants something else. I mean, that may be the job of a king. But at the end, not the job, but the nature of a king. But at the end of it, there always is some point where the king decides that this is how this should be. Or if it's about evil king, this is what he wants. Or if it's a good king, they would say, of course, God's will be done. This is the first time I observed that Ahasuerus actually started thinking for himself. And I'm not sure if it was the influence of Esther, because it seemed to me that he really loved, like he didn't know love before Esther. But what she told him, it made him unable to sleep. She learns of what Mordecai did, and he wants now to honor Mordecai, of course, with Haman's help. This is Haman, the same Haman who decided to annihilate the Jews. So that was in the first banquet. And of course, what she told the king troubled him. He started thinking. Chapter 7, we go into it, as where the second banquet is introduced. She grapples up the courage to let them know, well, I am Jewish. I am the queen. I am Jewish. And she directly say, I know that this is what Haman is planning to do, to kill me and my people. Of course, the king would not have known she was Jewish before, Haman himself neither. And he didn't even think twice. Usually, he would have gone to one of his advisors. What shall I do? And the first thing he did was he becomes enraged. And he said, well, Haman has to be executed. He can't do this. I'm already seeing how Esther started to influence her husband as a king. Her influence started to come in. So whereas he was before thinking about wealth and ego and riches and all the physicals and all the luxuries that come with the kingdom, now he's starting to have some sort of a moral, start to think. And that's where I observe Esther's actions, her courage, and probably her daily actions that may not even be recorded here, or started to influence how the king is, or Ahasuerus' personality on his own. So for me, that's one of the triumphs that I observe with Esther and Ahasuerus' relationship. In chapter 8, of course, he had to reverse Haman's decree. And in true style, as well, just as he did when he ordered Haman's execution, it wasn't through it wasn't through the servants and the chamberlains and stuff and the princes, as in chapters 1, 2, and 3, where he went to them for everything, and as chapter 1 said, as is the style of King Ahasuerus. He reverses Haman's decree and grants the Jews their freedom. Right? And of course, at that point in time, all Jews would have rejoiced and stuff would have come out blatantly and were able to, even though periodically, to rejoice and stuff that this decree was overturned. And this came from the king, so this was law, right? The Jews now, they of course would have existed in Shushan, in the empire. And so now they are no longer hiding, they are able now to defend themselves against the enemies. Right? And Haman's sons were out of the lot that would have come up against them, and would have come up against them, and of course the Jews were able to defend themselves. I think they even killed Haman's sons, right? And at the end of it, at the end of the Esther, the account of Esther, you see where Ahasuerus continued as king, and Mordecai was, of course, up there with Ahasuerus. He even gave him his ring, and gave him his ring, and now seeing the Jewish influence on this Persian empire, at least on this Persian king for the duration. We're now seeing that huge change in Ahasuerus from where he started to now where his personality expresses now one of more, I don't want to say dominance, because he was dominant physically, but now more mental acumen, more standards, more morals, more thinking for himself, now more acting as a king, right? Of course, Mordecai being their right-hand man can now influence his decisions and his decision making. And of course, the way that it was done, it wasn't as dominant and dogmatic. Mordecai would now explain and try to influence and have you think, okay, if this happened, what would happen? And of course, that him being there now was influential for the safety of the Jews during that time. So in a nutshell, the relationship that Ahasuerus was, and I think I am kind of looked at him as the main character, him now being the person that would have interacted with all of the other characters in the story. So yes, the story is about Esther, but I looked at the changes in Ahasuerus' character before and after Esther came into his life. Esther, Mordecai, and of course the Jews. Right? So that's it for me at this point in time. Thank you very much, sisters, and I hope that we'll have a lot to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sister Susanna, for that riveting talk on Ahasuerus, pointing out of all the personalities and characters of all three. So we are going to, the questions and comments are going to be left for after the second talk. So we're going to have a 5-minute break right now. We come back at 1:52 right now. We come back at 1:57. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back to listen to Sister Abigail with her topic. Sister Abigail,
just a second.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so now you can hear me and you could see me. I'm using 2 devices here because I can't get my camera working on the laptop. But before we start, is there any way that I could screen share, please?
Yes, go right ahead.
All right, thank you. All right, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Great. All right, so good afternoon, sisters. I hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. Today my topic is Ahab and Jezebel. And thank you for the reading that was done. I put together a little PowerPoint presentation. and I did not put any words in it because I wanted it to be a bit visual for you. So I know we are listening, but I want us to also be seeing something. Right, so let's get into the talk. The theme is the trials and triumphs of couples in scripture. What can we learn and how does it help us? Okay. In the land of Phoenicia stood the proud city of Tyre. This is just a little representative. This first screen is just a little representative of Ahab and Jezebel, what they may have, looked like a bit. And here we have a map. So we're looking here at Phoenicia. And if you look along the coast there, you come down there, you're going to see a word, you're going to see Tyre. You're going to see a dot marked Tyre. So that is the city of Tyre. Tyre stood as the richest, greatest port in the Eastern Mediterranean. Tyre was supreme. It drew in all the merchandise of the West, and it had for its trading hinterland all the lands of the East. It was the envy of many nations. In the days of David and Solomon, the nation of Israel had had very friendly relations with the kings of Tyre, and Phoenician experience and skill had even been used, if we would remember, in the construction of God's temple in Jerusalem. Even after the death of Solomon, the kings of Tyre were still very powerful and important, and their influence was wide. Thus, when Ahab, son of Omri, ascended the throne of Israel, he thought it expedient to make an alliance with the Phoenicians through marriage. And he took who? Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, to wife. This was his first mistake. And so we see that in 1 Kings 16, verse 31, which our sister would have previously read. So we're not going to read that again. Ethbaal, which means with Baal, was the high priest to the chief goddess of the Phoenicians, Ashtoreth of the Sidonians. She represented, let me show you a picture. I hope nobody is going to blush with some of these pictures, right? Because this is really what happened, okay? She represented love, fertility, and sometimes war. And we say war because it was in her temple that Saul's corpse was placed in 1 Samuel 31, verses 8 to 10. She was often depicted as a nude female. If you would look at your screen, she was depicted as a nude female with exaggerated sexual features, reflecting her role as a fertility goddess. She was sometimes identified as a moon goddess, representing the passive principle in nature, in contrast to Baal, who was a sun god and was her male counterpart. Now, during my research, some say that Baal was her husband, some say he was her son. I'm not completely sure, but regardless, both Baal and Ashtoreth were fertility gods. Baal focused more on agricultural fertility, rain, crops, etc., while Ashtoreth was tied more closely to human fertility and sexuality. So let me show you the next slide. And here we have some idols, I guess, that were found, real life idols that were found to represent Baal. And if you look at the next slide, you would see that the hands of the idols were up because he is holding a tree in his hand. And I don't know if that looks like a sickle or something in his hand. So that's why his hands are outstretched like that. And then next to him, we have Ashtoreth, right? So their worship often included ritual practices meant to ensure prosperity and reproduction. They were the dream team, you know, for the Canaanites. Not content with being high priest at Baal, who is Jezebel's father, his ambition was to become king priest. And he therefore murdered the reigning king, thought to have been his own brother, and took the throne over the Phoenicians in Tyre. Now, sisters, think fast. Who could tell me in scriptures who else we know to be king priests? Just shoot some names for me. Who was and who attempted to be? Nobody? How about Melchizedek? He was a king priest. Our Lord Jesus Christ will be king priest when he returns. But the ones who attempted, if we would remember, is King Uzziah. He attempted to do the priestly duties. And what happened to him? I know you know this one. What happened to him when he attempted to do the duties of the priest? God struck him immediately with something. What was that disease?
Leprosy.
Right. Thank you so much. He was immediately struck with leprosy. And then we also have Saul, who couldn't wait on Samuel, and he offered the sacrifices to take matters into his own hand. And when Samuel returned, he prophesied the demise of Saul's kingdom. So in this atmosphere, Jezebel would have been brought up and would later raise her daughter, Athaliah, with a similar mindset. She was the true daughter of a ruthless man who stopped at nothing to get his own way. She would have been very accustomed to every luxury that riches could buy and would have grown up in splendor. Because where was she living before? Tyre. Tyre is a hub. You know, all the merchants came to Tyre. So she would have had all this great riches and splendor, anything a girl could dream of. You could imagine that Jezebel had it, right? Reared in the philosophy that the kingly and, I'm sorry if you're hearing this music in the background. Reared in the philosophy that the kingly and priestly offices were rightly vested in the most important man in the kingdom, that human lives were disposable, and that any opposition must be instantly crushed. Now, Ahab himself, although showing himself to be gentle and generous feeling at times, was weak-willed. Yet he is shown to be a valiant warrior whose aid was sought by the nations around Israel. But he was no match for his strong-willed wife, and she had no intentions to conforming to his God. When she was coming to Israel, what did she bring with her? She brought her Ashtoreth, or another name is her Asherah, from Tyre. And of course, the Israelites took readily to this new worship and its orgiastic festivals. This worship include what is called sacred prostitution. In some Canaanite and neighboring cultures, women and men would engage in sexual acts in or near the temple possibly as part of a ritualistic appeal to the gods like Asherah and Baal for fertility. And the Bible refers to temple prostitutes in Deuteronomy 23, verses 17 to 18, and 1 Kings 14 to 24. Worship often took place in high places or elevated outdoor shrines and involved Asherah poles, which are like wooden symbols representing the goddess or sacred trees. In these sites, there would be a communal feasting and group sexual activity as a form of sacred celebration. Now, Jezebel established 2 sanctuaries for each of her gods at each of the 2 new capitals of the kingdom. Those were Jezreel and Samaria. She then installed 400 priests at Jezreel and 450 in Samaria. And we find that in 1 Kings 18, verses 19. Can I have a sister read that for me, please? It is 1 Kings 18, verses 19.
Okay, I'm reading 1 Kings 18, verse 19, and I'm reading from the NLT. Now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who are supported by Jezebel.
Thank you, sister. She was ruthless in annihilating any opposition to her religion. She hunted down the prophets of the Lord mercilessly until they had to go underground and hide in caves. With all of this, it wasn't surprising that she hated the prophet Elijah with every fiber of her being, because he alone stood as a threat between her and her ambition to completely overthrow the worship of Yahweh. We would all remember all too clearly the incident at Mount Carmel with Elijah against Jezebel's priest. And although we won't recount that story right now, I'm not going to tell you that whole story over, but I'd like us to watch a video together. Let's see if we could hear this properly. I saw this a while back. I just went to find this again. It's not completely like accurate, but it really drives home emotion of what the day could have looked like. And personally, when I first saw it, I had a bit of goosebumps. So let's see if I could play that for you. Can you hear? Okay, sisters, were you able to hear that and see that carefully?
Yes.
Just respond with a yes. Okay, great. So after this dramatic showdown on Mount Carmel, Elijah instigated the slaughter of the priests of Baal, sending Jezebel into a rage. She swore to take vengeance on Elijah in 1 Kings 19, verse 2. And if any of you could remember what she said, a bit from memory, not word for word necessarily, but she said, the gods do unto me and more also, if by this time tomorrow I do not make you as one of them, like as in one of her prophets that he had slaughtered, right? And we would remember that Elijah was so scared and he made a dash for it to get out of there as quickly as possible. In 1 Kings 21, the scripture set the scene for Naboth's vineyard, which Ahab wanted to make his own herb garden. And here it really shows his weak character. So can I have another sister read for me 1 Kings 21, verses 1 to 4?
I read, sister. 1 Kings 21, verse 1 to 4. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it. Or, if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said unto Ahab, The Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my father unto thee. And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased, because of the word of Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my father. And he laid him down upon his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no bread.
Thank you so much for that reading. Well done. So Naboth refused his offer. You know, Ahab says, I'm making you a deal here, right? I'm king. I'm making you a deal. You should be grateful, you know, that I'm even approaching you with such a good deal. I am going to either pay you for the vineyard, or I'm going to give you someplace even better. And Naboth says, no, to me, the king? No. So after Naboth refuses his offer, what does he do? What does this great king of a whole country do? He goes in his bed and he turns away his face and he stops eating and he sulks like a toddler. And when I was doing this talk, I remembered Sister Pat Kamamack, who recently passed on. Whenever she was talking this story, she used to dramatize it so well for us. She used to show us what she envisioned he would do, that he would turn his face and he would pout and, you know, like a child. It seems here that initially his conscience would not let him bully Naboth for it. But he didn't have to pout for long, because why? Big bad Jezebel stepped in to do the bullying for him. She writes letters to have Naboth set up and then stoned to death. She wrote the letter, she sealed it with Ahab's seal. What could they do? They had to follow through. So in that same vineyard, Elijah prophesied the end of Ahab's lineage and the death of Jezebel. Now, I didn't even show you the picture of Ahab pouting and pointing in his bed. If you look on your screen here, you would see a depiction of that. He's pointing outside because Naboth's vineyard would have been not too far from him. He could see it from where he lives. And so he's pointing through the window. He don't want to give me his vineyard. And I was so nice to him, you know? And Jezebel says, no worries. I got you. I got you. So we see another picture here of her. She's rolled up the scroll and she's putting the king's seal on it. And then we're seeing the people stoning Naboth to death. That man did not even do anything wrong. Okay, so next we have Elijah prophesying over them the death of Ahab's lineage and Jezebel. So let's focus in on the theme, sisters. The theme is the trials and triumphs. And we're going to now look at the triumphs first, because, you know, you want to give the good first. You don't want to start off with the bad. So let's give the good first. Triumphs. The first one we have is political power and expansion. Ahab reigned for 22 years and was considered politically successful. He formed strategic alliances, notably marrying Jezebel, which strengthens Israel's ties with Tyre and Sidon. And we know that this is also a similar thing that happened with Solomon. He married an Egyptian queen to make ties with Egypt. Ahab's reign included military victories, such as defeating Ben-Hadad of Syria and expanding Israel's influence. He also built significant structures, including an ivory house and cities showcasing architectural and civic achievement. And we find that in 1 Kings 22, verse 39, which we will not read. Now, they don't have a lot of triumphs. So we're going to move on to the trials. The first trial, idolatry and false prophets. Jezebel promoted the worship of Baal and Asherah, introducing widespread idolatry and opposing the worship of Yahweh. She persecuted prophets of Yahweh, leading to a religious crisis in Israel. And finally, the standoff on Mount Carmel, where Yahweh's power triumphed over Baal. So that would be a trial for them, not Elijah. Next, we have corruption and abuse of power. Jezebel orchestrated the murder of Naboth just so Ahab could seize his vineyard, a grave injustice. She also slaughtered many of Yahweh's prophets mercilessly. Next, on the trials, we have a spiritually weak-minded husband and king. Despite Ahab's many economic, civic, and architectural achievements, he was not strong in the ways of God like David, but rather followed in the steps of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin in 1 Kings 16, verses 31 and 33. Ahab had an incredibly special talent for provoking God to anger. It says, the scripture says, more than all the other kings of Israel that were before him. Wow! Because his father Omri had those same words used for him. He provoked God to anger more than all the other kings of Israel that were before him. And then his son came and outshined him in that respect, you know? He said, Daddy, sit down. I don't take over, you know, more than all the other kings of Israel. So he had that special talent. He could not keep himself, his wife, his children, or even Israel grounded in God. Now, what can we learn and how does it help us? 1, leadership without integrity leads to ruin. Ahab had political and military success, but his leadership lacked moral integrity as he tolerated and participated in idolatry and injustice. What is the lesson? Skill and success in leadership are not enough. Without godly character and accountability, even powerful leaders fall. Now, can I have a sister read for me Proverbs 14, verses 34? Proverbs 14, verses 34, please. Anybody who finds it first could go ahead.
Yeah, I'll read. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people.
Thank you. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. Number 2, the danger of influencing others for evil. Jezebel was a strong and influential queen, no doubt. But she used her influence to promote Baal worship, manipulate justice, and silence truth. She could have instead chosen to have been like another Deborah or even Esther, who our sister just spoke on, defending the people of Israel and fighting the battles of the Lord. But instead, her heart was so set on doing wickedly that at her end, no one was able to see, this is Jezebel. But her influence did not even end with her death. The corruption she started left traces in the northern kingdom, which no former reformations were able to entirely obliterate, and ultimately brought Israel to ruin. Jezebel's only legacy was a name for every kind of immorality. Up to today, it is actually disrespectful for anyone to refer to a woman as a Jezebel. That is no compliment. Imagine all these years have passed and her name is still remembered for one of the worst women in the history of mankind. Imagine that. Influence is a powerful gift. When misused, it leads to destruction. What is the lesson? Sorry, that was the lesson. Influence is a powerful gift. When misused, it leads to destruction. And so we have our reading from Matthew 18, verses 6. It says, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it is better if a millstone were hung around his neck." And we know the tragic end of Jezebel. Just look at the picture. You see the men trying to push her out the window and Jehu in the background and the dogs waiting to eat her up, very gruesome. Number 3, God sees and judges injustice. The murder of Naboth was a clear abuse of power. Our lesson: God is not indifferent to the cries of the innocent. Justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Isaiah 10, verses 1 to 2, it says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws to deprive the poor of their rights." Number 4, God gives warnings before judgment. Ahab was given chances to repent, even shown mercy after he humbled himself, but his repentance was shallow and short-lived. Our lesson: God is patient and merciful, but repeated rejection of his word leads to inevitable consequences. Can I have a sister read for me Galatians 6, verses 7? Galatians 6, verses 7.
Be not deceived. God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap.
Thank you, sister. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. And finally, our 5th one, true worship cannot be compromised. Jezebel's attempt to replace the worship of Yahweh with Baal worship brought national crisis. Lesson: mixing truth with falsehood in worship weakens a nation spiritually. Faithfulness to God is non-negotiable. And so for our final verse, we're going to ask a sister to read Exodus 20, verses 3. Exodus 20, verses 3.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness or of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth.
Thank you so much. The story of this couple is a sobering call to lead with integrity, worship with purity, and live with accountability before God. Now, sisters, before I finish in something that I have never done before, I want to read this poem for you. It is called "The Crown and the Curse," a poem of Ahab and Jezebel. In Samaria's halls, the king took his throne, with Jezebel, fierce by his side, well known. A crown on his brow, a scepter in hand, yet shadows of pride crept into the land. She came from the coasts where Baal was praised, and idols in fire and incense were raised. With beauty and will, she bent royal law and silenced the prophets who preached what they saw. Ahab, though mighty in chariots and shield, let truth be bartered and justice yield. When Naboth's vineyard caught his eye, he pouted in silence, he sulked with a sigh. But Jezebel rose with a serpent smile and plotted her scheme with cunning and guile. The righteous were slain, their names cast to dust, while greed fed the throne with blood and mistrust. Then thundered Elijah on Carmel's peak, as fire from heaven made Baal look weak. The people bowed down, the truth now revealed, yet hearts in high places remained unconcealed. Ahab for moments would tremble and bow, but change like the wind did not stay long now. He died, disguised on a battlefield's plain. An arrow of fate found its mark through his pain. Jezebel stood with painted pride, watching the city where truth once died. But dogs would devour the pride left behind, and judgment would come in Yahweh's time. So hear this tale of power and sin, of kingdoms lost from rot within. For crowns may dazzle, and thrones may gleam, but justice wakes, though long it seems. Sisters, thank you for your time.
Lovely poem. Very appropriate as well. Thank you, Sister Abigail. Thank you very much for your explanation. That was a very riveting exposition of Jezebel, of Ahab and Jezebel, and we see slight similarities in Esther's, what Sister Susan said, spoke about, and what you spoke. We see some slight similarities. So right now I'll turn this over to Sister Carolyn, who is gonna do the questions and comments, and we're gonna start with Sister Susan's talk. So Sister Carolyn, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sister Mary. Okay, sisters, now is the time to ask your questions and give comments. And as Sister Mary said, we'll begin with Sister Susan's talk first. So you can raise your hand, open your mic, or put your comment in the chat and I will read it. Go ahead, Esther.
Yes, it's Sister Esther. Thank you so much for your talk, both Abigail and Susanna. To deal with Susanna's talk, Sister Susan's talk, I was thinking of when she spoke, I couldn't help but when she spoke about Esther's character, I couldn't help but compare her with Abigail. Abigail had a difficult husband, a drunkard, and he could be very irrational and everything. So Abigail's life was really a life of misery with this person. And I think that Esther, to some extent, would have perceived the weakness of her husband, because Esther was a very wise woman. What I looked at was the humility of both women. When Nabal in his drunken state behaved so badly that David came with his troops and there would have been a bloodbath. But Abigail, in her wisdom, she intervened. And to show you she was not just a pretty face, Abigail knew her husband's possessions. She knew everything about it, so that when she was ready, she was able to get up supplies to take it to David to placate David. And when she went to David, she went in humility. Even though she was the wife of a rich person, she went with humility to David. And so she was able to stave off a tragedy. And so this is where I saw the two. Um, Queen Esther, she thought out her strategy very well, as our sister brought out. She didn't just rush into something. She thought about it. She planned it. And so when the time came, she too practiced humility, because when she went to the king at the second banquet, she said, if the problem was um if the problem was that he would have sold us, me and my people, as men, as female and male slaves, I would have held my peace. But she said the problem here is that this man wanted to destroy myself and my family, to annihilate them. And this is why I'm making this plea to you. So you could see the humility of Esther's approach to the king. And that moved the king. You know, when she compared things, that moved the king. And of course, we knew the results. Coming to Abigail's talk, again, I was thinking of the two queens. I mean, that was Jezebel was a queen, and Abigail, and Esther was a queen. And you look, Esther was a righteous woman. Our sister described Esther's character as the kind of character that a real queen should have. Jezebel was the complete opposite. And I couldn't help but looking at the outcome of both of them. Esther was able to save herself and her people. Jezebel was completely destroyed. She couldn't even save her sons, because when Jehu went to um, attack the sons, she had no power to save them. She had no power to save herself, because when they said throw out the window, the people did not hesitate. They just threw her out. No one sympathized with her. They just threw her out of the window. That was the end of her. So she couldn't save herself. She couldn't save her family. Unlike Esther, who was able to save herself and her people. So that's my comments. Hello?
Thank you,
Thank you,
sister.
sister.
Was I cut off?
No, we heard you.
Yeah, because my computer's giving me some problems.
So one thing I missed the whole slide, I'm sorry. But one thing I wanted to point out from Esther and the importance of what she actually covered. So Sister Esther kind of reminded me of it. It was her position as advocate between the Jews and the king, and the comparison to how Christ intercedes for us between God and man, between us and Christ. Basically, what Esther did is what Christ does for us every day. Esther risked her life and interceded on the Jews' behalf to the king, who, I mean, once she revealed her identity, could have gone anyway. But I think, as his sister Esther rightfully said, her personality, the humility with which she would have addressed her husband, and the fact that she had God on her side, ended up in such a positive outcome. So as it is, she stood in the gap for the Jews as Christ stands in the gap for us. And it's something I wanted to really point out.
I forgot to mention that I thought that both talks were very well done. They were very well researched, and the history that was given for both talks was really enlightening. So thank you very much, sisters, for a job well done.
Welcome, Auntie Esther.
Hi, good evening. Sister Susanna, thank you once again for your talk. I was just wondering, what came to mind with Vashti is the way she refused. It seemed to have been a pattern of Ahasuerus of embarrassing her when he's drunk. Not necessarily when he has a feast, because that was his first feast in 3 years, his first big feast in 3 years. So, I was thinking there's no telling if she may have been embarrassed more than once at his drunken stupors, when he have maybe, some of his servants or friends over or whatever, if you want to call it that. So because it would have taken something more than her just refusing for the very first time, refusing to be shown about like how he did, how he was about to do her, why she refused. So I don't know if that came to mind, that is probably not the first time that he'd done something like that.
Yeah, I agree. That's what came to mind too. Sorry, Sister Esther, go ahead.
No, referring to that, I was thinking of that too. But then that is where I saw the difference between Vashti and Abigail.
Yeah.
Because whereas Vashti reacted to her husband's weakness, Abigail, they all, it was not the first time that this thing happened with Abigail and Nabal, because the servant said, you know what he is like.
Yeah.
The servant, when they were telling them how Nabal insulted David, they realized what Nabal had done, and they said, you know what he is like. And she and Abigail understood, because this was not the first time. This was his usual pattern. And so that even when she averted the tragedy, she didn't even bother to tell him while he was drunk. She waited until he was sober to let him know the danger that he had put his people in. So she knew him well. So I think that Vashti should have known that king well. And I think this is the difference between she and Esther. Esther studied the situation. And instead of barging into the king and accusing Nabal, his advisor, she used strategy to get the king's attention before she stated her case. So I could see the difference between the two. And then, of course, this shows you the difference between a person who has a righteous and sound approach to the person who has nothing like that. I mean, Vashti, like she was a woman of the flesh, and she reacted in a fleshly way, whereas Esther reacted with wisdom.
Very true. And it just shows a difference in character, as you pointed out. It just shows a difference in character. And in Sister Abigail's talk, you could see where even if, like Sister Susanna said, Ahasuerus was the king, but then it's like he was not making decisions. And then you see the similarity with Ahab as well. He was the king, but the decisions were being made by his wife. You know, so it's like they're in a position just for power. You know, but they listen to other people. So, you know, and it just goes to show that sometimes when God puts you in a position, he puts you in that position for a reason. And, you know, you are supposed to use that position, not to just usurp authority, you know, to show I can do this and I can do that. But also the subjects, the people that he puts not like under you, but the people that you're supposed to influence. You know, that's what he put you there for, so that you could be that mentor for the people under you. Because when they see what you are doing, obviously after you are gone, there's nothing for them to, you know, to learn from, because you have shown your true character. So this is what comes after. And it goes, you know, it goes for our ecclesias as well. When God has given you a position, you have to use that position so that the brethren and the sisters, or the brethren that he put you there for, to control, not to control, but the brethren that he put you there for a reason, you know, they're supposed to look up to you as the head of the ecclesia and say, yes, this ecclesia could propel forward because here we have a good example. And when that person is no more, the people that are coming after will definitely be just as good. But when you allow, say, outside influences, then, you know, there's nothing to look back on for the younger ones or for those coming after you.
Any other sister have any other comments or questions?
Just one more comment. In reading about Queen Esther, you it is noticeable that apart from the incident that happened, nothing else was spoken of Queen Esther. She seemed to have been in the background, because even at one time she said that the king had not called her in, I think, for a month or something like that. So you weren't hearing anything about her. So what was she doing? I mean, how was she functioning? But from what comes out, Esther was there and she had her head on, because when that when the king's life was being threatened, when that plot was made to assassinate the king, Esther, because of her relationship with her staff and those around her, if my memory serves me correct, Sister Susan, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Those people were able to go to and tell Esther what was happening, and Esther then certified Mordecai so that Mordecai could have warned the king. So that just shows you that Esther, her influence and her presence were being felt among the staff in the palace. And when there was a certain time when Esther, I can't remember the details now, but one of them could have told her that that Haman had a gallows built to to execute Mordecai, and they were able to say, hang Haman on that gallows. That meant that what was happening, the news were being fed to Esther. Esther kept in touch with her people. When Mordecai was going around in the sackcloth, Esther could have asked them, to find out from Mordecai what was happening. So obviously, even as a queen, she had a certain amount of influence around those who were close to her. She was completely attached to the eunuch that was in charge of her, and she did everything he told her to do. So in those, even though a lot of details are not shown yet, as you can see behind the scenes, Esther was really there, and she was in a way active in a silent way. And that's the same thing with Abigail. Abigail was in that house there, and she knew a lot about or her husband's possessions, so that when the time came that she was able to send that help to David, she was able to know what to send and how much to send. She was able to tell the servants, as a matter of fact, she was able to tell them, look, get so and so, which meant that she kept in touch. She kept in touch. And so sometimes we don't, it doesn't come out, the record doesn't come out and tell you, plainly what is happening, but you can read behind the scenes to see how you could read behind the scenes to see how things are happening. And it is also an indication of how we must live. We mustn't go about throwing ourselves around and that sort of thing, but our actions, our attitude, that is what is going to rule the day.
Okay, any more sisters? Sister Claudette, you don't have any comments? Sister Arville?
Not at this time, Sister Carolyn. Thank you so much. I'd like to say to both Sister Susanna and Sister Abigail for their very descriptive and detailed talks. They're very enlightening. Thank you.
Most welcome.
You're welcome, Sister Avril.
It seems Sister Susan and Sister Abigail, your talks were so well put forward that the sisters do not have any questions or comments for you. So if there are no more questions or comments, I must say thank you, Sister Susanna and Sister Abigail, for your exposition on the two kings. And so on the two kings and their relationships with their queens. So if there are no more questions or comments, I will turn it back over to Sister Mary.
Thank you, Sister Carolyn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sister Abigail and Sister Susanna, for doing such a wonderful job. Like Sister Carolyn just said, it seemed to be well understood about these characters, Ahab and Jezebel and King Ahasuerus, Vashti and Esther. I know there are topics characters we've been reading about for a long time, but you all just brought it home with your topic today. Thank you all very much. Also, thank you to everyone for coming on every month. Faithful